She connected her cabin to an underground spring. Ezra Bell, who had rebuilt settlers' cabins for 12 years, told her, "When that water turns your floor to ice, you and that boy will die inside the week." $31, a 6-year-old son, and no way to cut 6 cords alone. On January 9th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Clara Wren Hale had never laid pipe in her life. She had arrived in the Beaverhead Valley in August of 1887 with a husband who could swing an axe, a son who could carry kindling, and the certainty that timber and a sound stove were all any family needed to hold a Montana winter. By September, the husband was dead. The certainty died with him. Levi Hale went under a loaded wagon on a Thursday afternoon, 8 miles from their claim, hauling pine from a stand above the freight road. The rear axle cracked on a shelf of exposed granite. The logs shifted. One man cannot hold a wagon when gravity decides to take it, and Levi did not have time to jump. A freighter named Dawes found him pinned from the chest down with the mules standing calm in their traces, still chewing bunch grass while the man who fed them stopped breathing. Clara got the news from Dawes himself. He rode to the cabin carrying Levi's hat, and the look men wear when they have seen something they will not describe to a woman. Jonah was behind the cabin stacking bark chips into a wall. He was 6 years old. He did not understand why his mother sat down on the step and stayed there until the light changed. They buried Levi on the slope behind the claim with a pine marker and no minister because the nearest one charged $4 for the ride. Clara paid Dawes for the freight of the body. She paid the general store for the flour already on account. She paid the farrier for Levi's last shoeing. When the debts were settled and the burial was done and the wagon damage absorbed, Clara Wren Hale had $31.08, 1 milk goat, 2 sacks of oats, salt pork enough for 3 weeks if she stretched every meal, and a 12 by 16-foot cabin that was not finished. The cabin sat on a marginal claim off a feeder road used by freight wagons and rail salvage crews. It had a plank floor with gaps wide enough to feel the ground breathe through them. The chinking between the logs was half done. The roof was sound, but the skirt, the banked earth that should wrap the foundation against wind, covered only the north side. There was a loft for sleeping, but the ladder rungs were green wood, and one had already split. The stove was second-hand, bought from a man leaving the territory, and it had hairline cracks visible at the collar where the pipe met the iron. Every time Clara fed it past half load, she could smell smoke where smoke should not be. She had one axe. The eye was loose. She had no team, no saw partner, no sledge, and winter in the Beaverhead corridor did not negotiate. Ezra Bell arrived on the 4th day after the burial. He did not come to offer sympathy. He came to count. Ezra was 58 years old and had spent 12 winters hauling freight between mining camps in the territory. He had rebuilt cabins after chimney fires, shored up roofs after snow loads, and once dragged a dead horse out of a doorway in a blizzard so a family could close the door. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had seen enough winters kill enough people that he no longer had patience for hope without arithmetic. He walked the property the way a doctor walks a ward, boots crunching on the early frost crust, eyes measuring, mouth set. Clara followed him. Jonah watched from the step. Ezra stopped at the woodpile first. He looked at it for a long time. Then he toed a split round with his boot and said, 1 cord, maybe 1 1/4 if you count the green. Clara said nothing. He walked to the cabin's south side where the skirting stopped. He crouched and looked under the floor joists where daylight came through in pale stripes. He stood up and wiped his hands on his coat. Half a skirt, ground's already cooling underneath. You'll feel that through the floor by November. He checked the stove by opening the door and running his thumb along the collar crack. He closed it without comment. He looked at the loft ladder and the chinking gaps and the single pane of glass in the east wall that had no shutter frame. Then he stood in the yard and delivered the sentence. You need 6 cords minimum to hold a winter in this cabin with that stove. 8 if the road closes and you cannot buy emergency wood. You have 1 cord and a cracked stove and no skirt on 3 sides. He paused. That is not my opinion. That is the math. Clara asked him what a cord of delivered wood cost in the valley. $7 if you find a man cutting, $9 if you have to beg one to start. She had $31. 6 cords at $7 was $42. 6 cords at $9 was $54. She could not afford the minimum even at the cheapest price, and she had a child to feed through the months when the wood would burn. Ezra looked at Jonah on the step. The boy was holding a stick and drawing lines in the frost. Ezra looked back at Clara. When the stove iron splits and that water turns the floor to ice, he said, you and that boy will die inside the week. He did not say it to wound her. He said it the way a man reads a bill of lading. These are the numbers. This is what they mean. Clara asked if anyone in the valley would trade labor for future goods. Ezra shook his head. Winter labor has cash value. Every man with an axe is cutting for his own house or cutting for dollars. A widow with debt does not outbid either. He told her she should sell the claim before first snow, take whatever Silas Rook offered, and ride to Helena where she might find boarding house work. He told her this was not failure, it was sense. Clara watched him walk back to his horse. She looked at the woodpile. 1 cord and a quarter. She looked at the cabin with its gaps and its cracked stove and its half-banked walls. She looked at Jonah, who had stopped drawing and was watching her with the expression children wear when they know something is wrong, but not what. She did not sell. She spent 3 days doing what she could with what she had. She split the green rounds with the loose-eyed axe, working slowly to keep the head from flying. She re-chinked the worst gaps with mud and dried grass. She built a windbreak of stacked brush on the south side where the skirting was absent. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. The arithmetic had not changed. But her hands needed to move, and moving them was the only answer she had to Ezra Bell's verdict. On the 7th morning after the burial, she walked to the cut bank below the south pasture to fill the water bucket. The creek that fed through the valley was already showing ice at the margins, a thin skin that cracked under the bucket's lip. But below the cut bank, where the ground sloped and gravel showed between roots, there was a different kind of water. It seeped through the bank in a steady, clear flow. Not fast, not dramatic, just constant. A dark line of wet against the pale gravel, feeding into a shallow run that joined the creek 10 yards downhill. Clara had seen it before. Levi had called it the seep and used it for stock water in late summer when the creek thinned. She had never paid it much attention. It was just water finding its way out of the ground the way water always does. But this morning she noticed something. The creek margins were iced. The water bucket was cold enough to sting her knuckles, and the seep was not frozen, not even close. The water coming out of the bank felt warmer than the air. Mist curled off the surface of the run where it met the cold morning. She knelt. She put her hand in the flow, and the memory arrived the way memories do when the body calls them, not through thought, but through sensation. She was 9 years old, November in Ohio. Her father, a millwright and ditch man who spent his life moving water for other people's farms, had taken her to the wash house behind a neighbor's property. The wash house sat over a spring run, a shallow channel of groundwater that surfaced beneath the floorboards before draining into a ditch. Her father pressed her hand against a plank laid over the run. Frost rimmed the grass outside. Her breath was white. But the board was warm, not hot, not comfortable. Warm enough that the difference between the board and the air felt like a secret. Her father said, "Deep water keeps its own season. It does not care what the sky is doing." She had not understood. She was 9. She filed it the way children file things adults say, as a fact without a use. Now she was 32, kneeling in Montana gravel with a dead husband and $31 in a stove that was going to crack, and the water coming out of that bank was warmer than anything on the surface of her land. She stayed there for a long time. She watched the mist. She felt the water. She thought about the wash house plank and her father's hand over hers, and the word he used for what the ground did with heat. He called it the earth's own keeping. She had thought it was poetry. It was not poetry. It was physics. The logic built itself slowly, the way a trench builds, one shovel cut at a time. If the water coming from the spring carried the ground's steadier warmth, if it flowed constantly, driven by the pressure of the aquifer behind it, if she could capture that flow in something sealed, a pipe, a channel, something that would not leak or freeze, if she could run it beneath the cabin floor, under the boards where the cold ground was stealing heat from the room above, if she could keep the water moving so it did not stagnate and freeze, if she could vent it back out the downhill side and let it rejoin the drainage, then the floor would not freeze. The crawl space earth would not become a block of ice radiating cold upward into the room. The cabin would lose less heat through its weakest surface, not because the water was hot, because it was warmer than the killing air, and it moved, and moving warmth beneath the floor changed the entire battle. She would still need a stove, she would still need wood, but she would need less of both, and the margin between not enough and just enough might be the margin between living and dying. She sat back on her heels. The idea terrified her. She had never laid pipe. She had never pitched a trench to grade. She had never sealed a joint or boxed a spring or calculated fallover distance. She was a millwright's daughter, not a millwright. She had watched. She had not done. But Ezra Bell had told her the math, and the math said she could not survive the conventional way. She did not have enough money, enough wood, enough hands, or enough time. The only question was whether she could survive an unconventional way, or whether unconventional just meant dying with pipe in the ground instead of without it. She went back to the cabin and told Jonah they were going to do something that would sound strange. Martha Keene came by that afternoon. Martha was a neighbor, mother of 5, married to a man who cut timber with mechanical reliability and stored it with mechanical precision. Martha had survived her own winters through hard, proven, repetitive labor. She did not believe in cleverness. She believed in cord counts. Clara told her what she was thinking. Martha stood in the yard and looked at the cut bank and looked at the cabin and looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has been asked to evaluate someone else's fever dream. "You want to run spring water under your floor," Martha said, "through pipe, sealed pipe, underneath the boards, to heat the cabin, to keep the floor from freezing, to hold the crawl space above the worst cold. So I need less wood and less fire to keep the room livable." Martha folded her arms. "Won't it rot your floor?" "Not if the pipe is sealed and the boards stay dry." "What if a joint bursts under the bed?" "I'll test every joint before I close the floor." "What if it backs up and turns the whole house to mud?" "The fall will carry it out the downhill side. It only needs to flow. It does not need pressure." "And what if it freezes in January and you have 40 feet of ice under your cabin and a boy sleeping on top of it?" Clara did not have an answer for that one. Not yet. She said, "Then I'll be no worse off than I am now, because right now I have 1 cord of wood and a cracked stove and Ezra Bell telling me to sell." Martha unfolded her arms. She looked at Clara for a long time. Then she said, "Why would you drag iron when you should be dragging wood?" It was the most practical question anyone asked. Clara heard it the way it was meant, not as mockery, but as the genuine confusion of a woman who had always survived by doing the hard, obvious thing. "Because I cannot drag enough wood," Clara said. "I have counted. I have measured. Even if I cut every day from now until the snow flies, I cannot stack 6 cords alone with 1 axe and no team. The wood is not possible. The water is there." Martha left without endorsing the plan. She did not condemn it either. She simply could not fit it into the way she understood winter. Winter was wood. Wood was labor. Labor was men. Clara had no men. Therefore, Clara had no winter. The conclusion should have been sell and leave. Clara's answer was change the equation. Martha did not know what to do with that. The pipe came next, and the pipe almost ended everything before it began. Clara learned from a freighter passing through that a wrecked spur line 12 miles south had scattered salvage along the grade: iron pipe, rail fittings, coupling stock, and heavy hardware left by a contractor who went bankrupt before the line was finished. The salvage sat on land now claimed by a speculator in Helena, who did not bother to post a guard because the material was too heavy to steal casually. To get wagon access to the site, Clara needed to pay a teamster. To pay a teamster, she needed cash. She had $31, and every dollar she spent on pipe was a dollar she could not spend on flour, salt, or the emergency wood she might need if the system failed. She sold Levi's spare harness leather for $3. She sold her silver-backed brush, the one piece of vanity she had carried from Ohio, for $2.50. She traded a future calf claim from the goat's next breeding for a day of wagon use. For those trades, she got a wagon ride to the salvage site and the right to load what she could carry in a single trip. She came back with 6 lengths of heavy iron pipe, each roughly 7 feet long, thick-walled and rust-scaled but sound. Cast iron from a municipal or rail supply run, the kind of pipe that was already standard in waterworks and contractor supply by the 1880s. She also carried 3 joint sleeves, a bag of oakum fiber, and a length of wire she thought she could use for hanging. Total investment, $5.50 in trades and 1 future calf. Total remaining cash, $31.08, minus the flour and burial costs already paid. She was operating on a margin so thin that a single broken pipe length would represent a disaster she could not replace. Silas Rook found out about the pipe before the wagon ruts dried. Silas was 44, yard boss for a timber and freight outfit that operated across the corridor. He was not tall, but he was broad, and he carried himself with the particular authority of a man who controlled the thing other people needed, in his case, cut timber and hauling capacity. He had offered Clara an insulting price for the claim within a week of Levi's death. $60 for a quarter section with water access, a standing cabin, and a cleared freight approach. Clara had refused. Silas had smiled the way men smile when they know time is on their side. Now he heard that the widow was hauling iron pipe instead of buying wood, and his smile changed to something sharper. He found Clara at the freight siding, where she was measuring pipe sections with chalk, marking lengths against the distance she had paced from the spring box location to the cabin crawl space entry. Silas stepped on the end of the pipe she was measuring. He put his weight on it. Clara looked up at his boot, then at his face. "All this iron," Silas said, "and you still cannot name me one winter it fed a family." Clara straightened up. She held the chalk. She did not step back. "It does not have to feed one," she said. "It only has to carry." Silas did not understand the answer, and what Silas did not understand, Silas dismissed. "You know what I hear at the store? She's piping creek water under the crib. Widow's gone book mad." He lifted his boot from the pipe and leaned closer. "Spring under a floor means fever, rot, burst joints in January, and when it fails, because it will fail, I will buy that place for the back taxes and tear the boards up for kindling." He wanted the claim. It sat on a route he hoped to consolidate for his freight operation. Clara's failure was not just expected, it was profitable. Every day she spent on pipe instead of wood was a day closer to the moment when she would have to sell or freeze. Clara said nothing else. She went back to measuring. At the store that week, the talk was specific and unkind. "She's built herself an indoor creek. Wait till January. She'll be sleeping over a coffin." "A woman with no woodpile is a woman packing to leave." "Spring water under boards. My grandmother would have called that inviting the devil to dinner." The gossip was not just noise. In a valley economy built on mutual aid and shared labor, reputation was currency. If Clara was branded reckless, if the community decided she was a fool, wasting resources on a mad idea, the consequences were material. Credit at the store would tighten. Men would not lend tools. Neighbors would not offer the small kindnesses that kept marginal homesteads alive. A bucket of rendered fat, a day of borrowed oxen, an extra cord sold at cost instead of market. And worse, if she was seen as an unfit mother, Jonah would be marked. The widow's burden. The boy whose mother chose cleverness over sense and froze them both. Clara knew this. She felt it in the way conversation shortened when she entered the store. She felt it in the way Martha's husband nodded without stopping when he passed on the road. She felt it in the silence where help should have been. She kept working. The first trench cut began on a Tuesday, 6 weeks before the first hard freeze was expected. Clara marked the line from the spring box to the cabin with stakes and twine, following the natural fall of the ground. The spring sat above the cabin's elevation, which meant gravity would do most of the work if the grade was right. If she had never measured grade before, she knew the principle from watching her father. Water flows downhill, and the angle of the downhill determines the speed and consistency of the flow. Too steep and the water races through, too fast to transfer warmth, too shallow and it pools, stagnates, and freezes. She needed a steady, gentle fall across roughly 42 feet from the spring box to the cabin entry, then 18 feet of underfloor run in a gentle path beneath the boards, then a shorter drop to the outlet on the downhill side. She used the only tools she had, a length of twine, a bead of water on her finger to check level, and the patience to redo what she got wrong. The digging was brutal. The valley soil was mixed, gravel beds, clay pockets, root networks from scrub pine and willow. Every foot of trench required clearing, leveling, and checking. Her hands blistered inside the first hour. By the end of the first day, she had cut 8 feet of trench to a depth she thought was right, and discovered that the last 3 feet were off grade by enough to pool water in a shallow belly. She dug them out and started again. Jonah helped where he could. He carried rocks out of the trench. He held the twine taut while Clara sighted along it. He brought water from the creek for drinking and watched his mother work with the solemn attention of a boy who understood that something important was happening even if he could not name it. By the end of the first week, Clara had trenched 26 feet. Her shoulders ached in a way that woke her at night. The blisters on her palms had broken, bled, scabbed, and broken again. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and the weather was changing. Morning frost arrived earlier each day. The creek ice thickened from the margins inward. The light shortened. Clara could feel the season turning the way an animal feels a predator approaching, not as a thought, but as a pressure in the chest that said, "Move faster." There is less time than you think. She had 16 feet of trench left to dig. The spring box was not yet built. The pipe was not yet laid. The underfloor route was not yet cut. The outlet was not yet dug. The joints were not yet sealed. And every morning the frost line crept closer to the surface, hardening the ground she still needed to open. At the end of the second week, her axe handle cracked at the shoulder while she was prying a root from the trench line. The crack did not break through, but it weakened the handle enough that full swings were no longer safe. She wrapped it with wet rawhide and let it dry tight, which held the split closed but reduced her striking power by a third. She kept digging. On the first day of October, Jonah woke with a cough that sounded wet and deep. By midday, he was feverish. By nightfall, he was coughing hard enough to bring up clear fluid, and Clara sat on the edge of his cot with her hand on his chest, feeling the rattle under his ribs, and understanding for the first time that the stakes were not abstract. This was not a math problem. This was not an argument with Ezra Bell or a gamble against Silas Rook's greed. This was a 6-year-old boy coughing in a cabin that could not hold warmth, and if she failed, if the pipe leaked, if the grade was wrong, if the joint split, if the spring slowed, if any single link in the chain she was building broke, he would be the one who paid. She did not sleep that night. She sat with Jonah and listened to his breathing and felt the cold coming through the floor beneath her feet and knew that the cold was winning and the trench was not finished and the pipe was still stacked in the yard and nobody in the valley believed she could do this. Ezra Bell rode past on the 3rd of October and stopped to look at the trench from the road. He did not dismount. He sat his horse and studied the line of stakes and the raw earth and the pipe sections laid out on planks beside the route. "You're building comfort out of weather," he called down to her. Clara was standing in the trench with clay on her boots and mud on her coat and her son's cough still echoing in her ears. She looked up at the man on the horse, the man who had counted her failure before she began, the man who had told her to sell and leave, the man whose arithmetic was right and whose conclusion was wrong. She reached down and touched the nearest pipe section. It had been sitting in the morning sun for an hour. The iron held warmth the way iron always does, reluctantly but faithfully. "No," she said, "I am building time." Ezra stared at her. He did not answer. He rode on. The trench reached the cabin foundation on the 9th of October. Clara had been digging for 23 days. She had lost 11 pounds. Her hands were calloused hard enough to strike a match on, and the hardest part had not started. Now she had to go underneath. The cabin floor sat roughly 18 inches above grade on foundation stones. The crawl space was dark, narrow, and already cold. Clara would need to dig a shallow channel under the boards, lay pipe in a gentle path that maximized the contact area between warm iron and cabin floor, and seal the connections at both entry and exit points. She crawled under the cabin on her belly with a hand spade and a lantern. The ground was packed hard. Roots from the foundation plantings threaded through the soil. The space was tight enough that she could not swing even the short spade. She had to scrape and pull, working backward on her elbows with dirt falling into her collar and the lantern throwing strange shadows against the underside of the floor she was trying to save. It took 4 days to cut the underfloor channel. 18 feet of shallow trench, 8 inches deep, carved by hand in a space where she could not stand, could not kneel, and could barely turn around. When she emerged each evening, she was covered in clay dust, her elbows were raw, and Jonah would bring her water with the careful seriousness of a boy who has decided that helping is the same as understanding. The pipe went in next, 6 sections connected by joint sleeves packed with oakum fiber and sealed with clay she had mixed with tallow for grip. Each joint had to be tested. Each connection had to hold. One leak under the floor would mean mud, rot, and the vindication of every skeptic in the valley. She tested each joint by pouring water through the assembled sections in the yard before hauling them into the crawl space. One sleeve leaked. She repacked it twice before it held. Another had a hairline crack she had not seen at the salvage site, a fault in the casting that would eventually fail under frost pressure. She cut that section out and spliced the remaining pipe with wire binding and triple-packed oakum, which reduced her total underfloor run by 14 inches, but eliminated the weak point. By mid-October, the pipe was laid. The spring box was not yet built. The outlet was not yet dug. The skirting was not yet banked, and the ground was freezing. Every morning the frost line was deeper. Every morning the digging was harder. Every morning the window between Clara and winter was narrower, and the list of things still undone was longer than the list of things done. She was running out of time. She was running out of strength, and nobody was coming to help. The last thing she did each night before sleeping was put her palm flat against the cabin floor. The boards were cold. The crawl space beneath them was cold. The earth under that was cold. The entire foundation of her home was a slab of frozen ground radiating cold upward into the room where her son slept. She pressed her hand to the wood and tried to imagine warmth. It was not there yet, but the pipe was. Niels Tollefson arrived on a Tuesday in the third week of October, leading a swayback mule with a cracked pack frame and a disposition that matched the animal's brawn, patient, deliberate, unimpressed by distance. He was 64 years old, Norwegian-born, raised on a farm above a fjord where the snow line started in September, and the ground did not thaw until May. He had come to America in 1859, worked 12 years on waterworks construction in Minnesota and Wisconsin, dug ditches, and laid pipe for municipal water systems that served towns he never lived in, then drifted west with the railroad labor camps until his back gave out and his knees stopped bending the way knees should. He had been a ditcher, a sawyer, a pipe man, and a millwright's assistant. He carried a cord line in his coat pocket the way other men carried tobacco. He measured the world in fall and grade. He came to Clara's claim because he had heard at the Crossroads store that a woman near the feeder road kept goats and sharpened tools for trade. He wanted milk for his stomach, which no longer tolerated salt meat well, and a file run on his adze blade, which had gone dull-splitting kindling on frozen ground. Clara was in the trench when he walked up. She was on her knees checking the fall of the pipe route with her twine and a bead of water on her fingertip, watching which way the drop ran along the string. Niels stopped. He watched her for a full minute without speaking. He looked at the twine. He looked at the water bead. He looked at the angle of the trench and the pipe sections waiting on planks and the spring box location staked with a cairn of flat stones. Then he said, "Your fall is short by a thumb's width at the third stake." Clara looked up. She saw a lean man with white hair cut close, a face that had been outdoors for 6 decades, and hands that were scarred across every knuckle in the pattern of a man who had worked iron and stone. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I've laid 9 miles of pipe in my life, and your water bead is lying to you. The wind pushes it." He crouched at the trench edge, slowly, the way men crouch when their knees have opinions, and sighted along the twine from the spring box stake to the cabin entry. He held up his thumb at arm's length and closed one eye. "There," he said, pointing at the third stake, "the grade bellies. You will pool water in that section. In December, the pool freezes. In January, the freeze backs up to the joint behind it. By February, you have 18 inches of ice in the pipe and no flow." Clara stared at him. Nobody in the valley had understood what she was building well enough to criticize its grade. The skeptics had called it madness. The neighbors had called it an indoor creek. Ezra Bell had predicted her death from it. But nobody had looked at the trench and said the fall was wrong at the third stake. Niels said, "I will take goat milk and a sharpened adze. You will take advice. That is a fair trade." He stayed through the afternoon. He did not offer help. He offered correction. There is a difference, and Clara felt it immediately. Help is charity. Correction is respect. Niels corrected her because he recognized that she was doing something real, doing it with the right instinct, and doing it wrong in 2 specific ways that would kill the system before winter tested it. The first error was the grade belly at the third stake. He showed her how to recheck fall using a glass bottle filled with water and a cord line pulled taut between 2 fixed points. The bottle, laid on its side at the cord, would show by the water line inside it whether the ground beneath was level, rising, or falling. It was a ditcher's tool. Simple, accurate, and not dependent on wind the way a water bead on a finger was. Clara redug the belly section that evening. The trench was already hard from overnight frost. She broke the surface with the axe and cleared it with the hand spade, By lantern light, she rechecked with the bottle. The grade was true. The second error was depth. Clara had run the pipe too shallow near the planned outlet, the point where the return flow would exit the cabin's far side and drain downhill to the stock trench. Niels told her that the outlet was the weakest point in any gravity-fed run because it was where moving water met standing air. In Minnesota, he had seen municipal outlet pipes freeze shut when they were less than 20 inches below grade. In Montana, with wind exposure and no urban heat, she needed the outlet section at least 26 inches down, shielded by a plank chase and packed earth. "You bury the weak point," he said. "You do not leave it where the wind can find it." Clara dug the outlet deeper. It cost her a full day of labor she had planned to spend on the spring box. The countdown tightened. Niels came back the next morning. He had not promised to. He simply appeared with the mule, carrying a pouch of pine tar and a handful of iron wedge shims he had traded for somewhere on the road. "Your joints," he said. "You packed them with oakum and clay. And tallow. Tallow dries and cracks in cold. You need pine tar over the oakum. It stays pliable below freezing. The clay goes over the tar as a shell. 3 layers. Oakum, tar, clay." He showed her on the first joint. He packed the oakum with a flat stick, pressing it into the gap between pipe and sleeve until the fiber was dense and uniform. Then he heated pine tar in a tin cup over a small fire and poured it slowly over the oakum, letting it soak into the fiber and fill the remaining gaps. Then he pressed wet clay over the tar, smoothing it with his thumb until the joint wore a collar of hardened earth over sealed fiber over iron. "Test it," he said. Clara poured water through the section. The joint held. No drip, no seep, nothing. "Now freeze it," Niels said. They left the section outside overnight. Morning temperature was 21 degrees. The joint held. The pine tar had not cracked. The clay shell was intact. Water still flowed. Clara resealed every joint in the line over the next 3 days. It was slow, precise work, and it consumed all of her remaining pine tar and most of the clay she had mixed. But when she finished, the pipe run from spring box to outlet was sealed tighter than anything she could have done alone. Niels taught her 2 more things before the system was closed. He taught her to bank the cabin. Skirting, the packed earth and material that wraps a cabin's foundation against wind and ground frost, was the difference between a house and a box sitting on frozen ground. Clara's cabin had skirting on one side. Niels helped her build it on the remaining 3 using sod, packed manure from the goat yard, and brush fence to hold the bank against wind. He worked beside her, not ahead of her. When she packed a section wrong, he said so. When she packed it right, he said nothing. That was how she learned which standard mattered. He taught her to think of the cabin as a machine, not a shelter. "A shelter keeps weather out," he said. "A machine manages heat. Your stove puts heat in. Your floor loses heat down. Your walls lose heat sideways. Your roof loses heat up. The spring does not add heat the way the stove does. The spring reduces what the floor steals. That is the difference. You are not heating the room. You are slowing the loss." Clara heard that and felt something shift in how she understood what she was building. She was not creating warmth. She was defending against the theft of it. The spring was not a furnace. It was a wall, a thermal wall beneath her feet, made of moving water that carried the earth's steadier temperature through dark pipe under worn boards. On the 29th of October, the spring box was finished. Clara and Niels built it together. A plank crib lined with clay and flat stone, set into the bank where the seep emerged, with a pipe fitting at the outlet that channeled the flow into the first section of iron. The box captured the spring. The pipe carried it. The grade moved it. The joints held it. The outlet released it. Clara opened the gate stone and let the water run. It took 11 minutes for flow to reach the outlet on the far side of the cabin. She and Niels stood on opposite ends of the system, Clara at the spring box, Niels at the outlet, and when he saw water emerge into the stock trench, he raised one hand. The system was live. Clara put her palm on the cabin floor. The boards above the pipe run were not warm, not yet. The water had been flowing for less than an hour, but they were not as cold as the boards over bare ground beside them. The difference was slight, a degree, maybe two. Barely enough to feel, but it was there. The earth's steadier temperature carried through iron, moving beneath her floor. Not luxury, not comfort, a margin. She pressed her hand harder against the wood and closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time since Levi died, that this might work. Then Jonah coughed from the loft, and the sound pulled her back. The system was live. The winter was not here yet, and the distance between a live system and a proven one was the distance between hope and survival. The first week of November brought confirmation and doubt in equal measure. Clara took measurements the only way she could, by watching, touching, and comparing. The water bucket on the table edge formed skim ice overnight. The floorboards over the pipe run stayed bare. That was measurable. The crawl space earth beside the pipe trench was hard enough to ring when struck with a stick. The earth directly around the pipe was still workable by spade. That was measurable. Jonah, who had been sleeping in the loft where cold air pooled against the roof, moved his blankets to the floor near the pipe run. He slept through the night without waking blue-lipped. Clara slept beside him and put her palm against the boards before dawn. The warmth was faint, steady, and real. But November cold is not January cold. Martha Keene told her so directly. Mild weather proves nothing, Martha said, standing in Clara's doorway with a basket of eggs she was trading for goat cheese. Your little creek might hold against 20 degrees. What happens at 20 below? What happens when the wind drives under the skirt and the pipe has nothing but frozen earth around it? Ezra Bell agreed. He stopped by the trench outlet on a morning ride and watched the water running into the stock trench. Steam rose from the flow where it met cold air. He watched it for a while. It runs, he said. I will grant that. But one bad blow will split every weak seam in that line. Iron shrinks in killing cold. Oakum does not shrink the same way. You have dissimilar contraction in every joint, and when one goes, the water has nowhere to be except under your floor. Clara asked if he had ever seen a pine tar sealed joint fail. Ezra had not. He said so honestly. Then he said, I have not seen a woman heat a cabin with a ditch either. There is a first time for many kinds of failure. He rode on. Clara went back inside and checked the pipe run by lifting a board. The water moved in the dark. The iron was damp with condensation, but not leaking. The joints held their collars of clay over tar over oakum. She had done everything Niels taught her. She had done everything she could imagine. And now she had to wait for the weather to decide whether imagination and teaching were enough. December passed in the particular slow terror of a frontier winter approaching. Cloud bands lowered over the valley. The light shortened until the days felt like interruptions between long nights. Freight stopped arriving regularly on the feeder road. The creek froze solid in the shallows, and the ice crept toward the deep channels. Snow fell, melted, fell again, and stayed. Clara cut wood. She had managed to stack 2.5 cords by working every hour the light allowed, splitting what she could with the repaired axe and dragging deadfall from the nearest timber with a rope harness she wore across her shoulders. 2.5 cords was not 6. It was not even half of what Ezra said she needed. But if the spring system held, if it reduced the heat loss through the floor by enough, 2.5 cords plus a working stove might be enough. If, on the 3rd of January, Clara woke to find the outlet flow reduced. She dressed in the dark and went outside with the lantern. The outlet pipe was clear. The stock trench water was running but slower than it had been in November. Somewhere in the line between the spring box and the cabin, or under the floor itself, the flow was constricting. She spent 2 hours checking every accessible joint with her hands. No leaks, no ice visible at the connections. But the flow was definitely slower. Something was narrowing the channel, silt, frost creep on the inner wall of the pipe, or a partial ice dam at a point she could not reach without tearing up the floor. She did not tear up the floor. She could not afford to. If she opened the system and the cold got in while the boards were up, she would lose whatever thermal margin the pipe had built in the crawl space earth. Instead, she increased the spring box flow by clearing accumulated gravel from the intake, hoping that higher volume would push through whatever was constricting the line. The flow improved slightly, not fully. Clara watched it and waited, and tried not to think about what January would bring. January brought it on the 9th. The morning of January 9th started with a lie. The sky cleared after days of low cloud. The temperature climbed. By early afternoon, men in the valley were working outside without heavy coats. A freighter stopped at the Crossroads store and said the road south was open and dry. Children played in the yard. The world pretended it was March. Clara felt the change the way her father had taught her to feel weather, not in the air, but in the ground. She put her hand on the earth beside the cabin at noon, and it was soft. She put her hand on the earth at 3 in the afternoon, and it was still soft. She put her hand on the earth at 4, and the softness was gone. The ground was tightening. The thaw had been a surface trick. Beneath it, cold was gathering. By 6 in the evening, the wind turned. It came from the northwest, which, in the Beaverhead corridor, meant the high country was emptying its worst air into the valley. The temperature dropped through the floor of the thaw like a stone through water. Clara brought Jonah inside. She closed the shutters. She fed the stove to half load, not more, because the collar crack worried her. She checked the pipe flow by pressing her ear to the floor. She could hear it. The water was still moving. By 8 in the evening, the temperature had fallen 25 degrees from the afternoon high. Wind drove snow horizontally across the yard. The drift began building against the east wall of the cabin, packing into the skirting and climbing toward the window frame. By midnight, the temperature had fallen more than 40 degrees from the thaw peak. The air outside was no longer cold. It was a physical force. It pressed against the cabin walls. It found the chinking gaps Clara had sealed and pushed through them as thin blades of frozen air. It wrapped around the stovepipe and howled in the collar joint. The stove iron ticked and popped as the metal contracted. Clara sat in the dark between the stove and the sleeping mat where Jonah lay. She had a hand on the floor. The boards over the pipe run were cool. Not cold, not warm. Cool. The boards over bare ground on the far side of the cabin were cold enough to sting her fingertips. The difference was still there. The spring was still carrying the earth's temperature through the pipe, but the margin was thinner than it had been in November, thinner than December, and the storm outside was not finished falling. At 2 in the morning, Jonah woke coughing. The chest cold that had never fully cleared came back with the force of a door slamming. He coughed until his face was red and his eyes streamed and his breath came in short, wet gasps. Clara held him upright and pressed a cloth to his mouth and saw pink in the spit, blood-tinged froth. Not much. Enough. She could not take him to a doctor. The nearest doctor was in town, 11 miles on a road that was now buried under drift. She could not keep him in the loft where cold air pooled. She wrapped him in every blanket she had and laid him on the floor directly above the pipe run, where the board still held that faint, steady difference between survivable and lethal. At 3 in the morning, someone pounded on the door. It was Martha Keene's oldest boy, 15 years old, hatless, coatless, shaking so hard he could barely speak. He said Ezra Bell's daughter-in-law had sent him. Ezra's stovepipe collar had cracked, not a hairline, a full split, and the stove was pouring smoke into the house. They had doused the fire to keep from choking, and now the house was going cold with 4 people inside, including 2 grandchildren under 10. Clara looked at Jonah on the floor. She looked at the boy in the doorway. The wind behind him was a sound like tearing cloth. She told the boy to bring them here, all of them, now. Then she went to the floor and lifted a board. The pipe was there, dark and wet with condensation. She put her hand on it. Warm. Not hot, not comfortable. Warm enough that the iron felt alive in the dead cold of the crawl space. The water was still moving. The spring was still feeding. The earth's steadier season was still coming through. She replaced the board and waited. Ezra Bell arrived 20 minutes later, carrying 1 grandchild under each arm. His daughter-in-law carried a sack of flour and a lamp. Ezra's face was white, not from cold, from the particular shame of a man who told a woman her idea would kill her and then came to her door because his own stove had failed. Clara did not say anything about that. She pointed to the floor near the pipe run and said, "Lay the children there. It is the warmest part of the room." Ezra knelt and put the children down. His hands touched the floorboards. He stopped. He looked at Clara. "The boards are warm," he said. "They are warmer than your house," Clara said. She sent Martha's boy back with instructions. Tell Martha to check the Keene stove and send word if anyone else was in trouble. Then she fed the stove 1 small log, not enough to stress the cracked collar, just enough to keep the air in the upper room above freezing, and she settled in to wait out the worst night of the winter with 6 people in a 12 by 16-foot cabin heated by a dying stove and an underground spring. At 4 in the morning, Niels arrived. He had walked 2 miles in the storm from a line camp where he had been repairing fence. His beard was frozen stiff. His coat was crusted white. He came through the door, and his eyes went immediately to the floor, not to the people. "Is the outlet clear?" he said. Clara felt the blood leave her face. She had not checked the outlet since the storm began. She had been inside with Jonah and then with Ezra's people, and she had not gone outside to verify that the return flow was still running. "I do not know," she said. Niels looked at her. "If the outlet is blocked, the water stops. If the water stops, the pipe freezes. If the pipe freezes under the floor, you have buried your heat where no fire can reach it." Clara put on her coat. She put on her boots. She wrapped a scarf across her face and went outside into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall. Drift was piled 3 feet against the cabin's east face. The outlet was on the south side, downhill, where the return pipe emerged from the cabin foundation and drained into the stock trench. She could not see it. The snow had buried the outlet chase under a smooth white slope that looked like the land itself had swallowed the pipe. She dug with her hands. The mittens froze stiff in seconds. She pulled them off and dug with bare fingers, clawing through compacted drift until she felt the plank chase Niels had told her to build over the outlet section. She tore the planks aside and found the pipe end. Ice. A plug of ice in the mouth of the outlet where the water met the standing air and the wind drove crystals into the opening. The flow behind it was backed up. She could feel pressure in the pipe when she put her hand around it. The water was there. It was just trapped. She broke the ice with a rock. She cleared the outlet channel. She packed snow around the pipe mouth to shield it from direct wind and replaced the plank chase at a lower angle, creating a windbreak. Water surged from the outlet. Warm water, warmer than her frozen hands, warmer than the air, warmer than anything that had a right to exist on a night that was killing livestock in their stalls. She knelt in the snow beside the outlet and let the water run over her hands. Feeling returned in a burn of pain that made her gasp, but the water was flowing. The system was alive. She went back inside. Niels looked at her hands. They were red and already swelling. He took them between his own and held them until the worst of the pain subsided. The outlet was iced, she said. And now? Clear. Running. Niels nodded. He did not say he had told her to dig the outlet deeper. He did not say the plank chase was his design. He said, "Then the floor will hold." It held. Through the darkest hours of the night, while the temperature outside dropped into the killing range and the wind screamed across the valley like a living thing, Clara's cabin held. The stove provided what it could, a small fire, carefully managed, enough to keep the upper air above freezing. The pipe run beneath the floor provided the rest, not warmth, not comfort, but the absence of the killing cold that radiated up through unprotected ground into every other cabin in the valley. Ezra's grandchildren slept on the floor above the pipe run. They slept without waking. Their blankets were not frosted. Their breath was visible, but their lips were not blue. On the far side of the room, where the floor was bare ground with no pipe beneath it, the boards were cold enough to sting bare feet. The difference was measurable in inches. On one side of a line drawn across the cabin floor, survivable. On the other side, dangerous. Outside, the valley was failing. Clara learned the details in the days after. One family abandoned their outer room when the water froze in the trough and the chickens died on the roost. They huddled in the inner room around a stove they overfired until the chimney pipe glowed red and they had to choose between burning alive and freezing. Silas Rook's bunkhouse lost draft when the flue iced over. 2 men nearly suffocated from backed-up smoke before they kicked the door open and let the storm in. They spent the night sitting in the wreckage of a room that was technically open to the outside, wrapped in every hide they could find, burning chair legs in a tin basin. Silas himself came to Clara's door at 5:30 in the morning, dragging one of his men by the arm. The man was gray-faced and barely conscious. Silas did not knock. He pushed the door open and stood in the frame with snow blowing in around him and his man sagging against his shoulder. Clara looked at Silas Rook, the man who had stepped on her pipe, the man who had told the valley she was building a coffin, the man who wanted her claim to fail so he could buy it for back taxes. She stepped aside and let him in. She put Silas's man on the floor above the pipe run. She gave him water. She wrapped him in a blanket from her own bed. She did not say a word about indoor creeks or coffins or who was right about the water. Silas stood against the wall and looked at the floor. He could feel what Ezra had felt. The boards were warm. The cabin was not luxurious. It was not even fully comfortable, but it was stable. It was breathable. Children were sleeping in it instead of convulsing from cold. The stove was running on fumes, and the room was still holding. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who did not have time for whatever he was about to say because she had 8 people in a cabin built for 3 and a son with blood in his cough. Silas did not speak. He sat down against the wall and waited for dawn like everyone else. Dawn came gray and still. The wind had stopped. The temperature had bottomed out somewhere in the range where exposed skin freezes in minutes and metal burns bare hands. The valley was white and silent and stunned. Clara opened the door and looked out. The drift against the east wall reached the windowsill. The stock trench was buried. The yard was a featureless plain of white. But at the south end of the cabin, where the outlet emerged from its plank chase, a thin dark line of water still ran. Mist curled from the flow. The spring was still feeding. The Earth's steadier season was still coming through the pipe. Niels came up behind her and looked at the water. "The ground gave you a steady source," he said, "and the moving water carried it under the room faster than the storm could steal it. That is all it was. That is all it needed to be." Clara stood in the doorway and felt the warmth at her back, the warmth of a room held alive by moving water and a failing stove, and the stubbornness of a woman who could not afford 6 cords of wood. Ahead of her, the valley was frozen. Behind her, children were sleeping on warm boards. The storm had tested every joint, every grade, every inch of oakum and pine tar and clay she had packed into the line, and the line had held, not because it was perfect, because it was enough. She closed the door. She checked on Jonah. He was sleeping. His forehead was warm from fever, not from cold. She put her hand on the floor beside him and felt the pipe's warmth beneath the wood and understood, for the first time without doubt, that she was going to survive the winter. The question now was what surviving would become. The storm broke on the 11th of January. 2 days of killing cold, then a slow gray brightening, then silence. The valley came out of its houses the way animals come out of burrows, blinking, careful, counting losses. Clara's cabin emptied over the course of a morning. Ezra Bell carried his grandchildren home to a house with a dead stove and a cracked pipe collar that would need a blacksmith's forge to repair. Silas Rook's man walked out under his own power, saying nothing, avoiding Clara's eyes. Martha's oldest boy came to collect his mother's egg basket and stood in the doorway looking at the floor as if it owed him an explanation. Clara cleaned. She swept the mud tracked in by 8 pairs of boots. She washed the blankets that smelled of other people's fear. She checked Jonah, whose cough had loosened overnight, and whose fever had cracked enough to let him eat broth without gagging. She checked the pipe run by lifting the board nearest the entry point. Water moved in the dark. The joints held their collars. The system was running as if the storm had been an ordinary night. Then she went outside and stood by the outlet and watched the water run into the stock trench, steaming faintly in the cold morning air, and let herself understand that she had won the argument nobody had believed she was qualified to have. Ezra Bell came back 3 days later. He came in daylight. He came on foot. He came without his horse, which meant he had walked from his place deliberately, choosing the effort of the walk over the ease of riding because what he had to say required him to be standing on her ground, not looking down from a saddle. Clara was stacking brush for the goat shelter when he appeared at the edge of the yard. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, literally in his hands, held at his waist the way men hold hats at funerals. "I told you the water would kill you," Ezra said. "It was my stove that failed first." Clara straightened up. She looked at the man who had counted her into a grave 2 months ago. His face was tired. His hands were chapped raw from the cold he had endured in a house his own methods could not keep warm. "Your stove did what stoves do," Clara said. "Iron cracks. And your pipe did not. My pipe had help. The man who sealed those joints knew more about cold iron than either of us." Ezra nodded. He looked at the ground. He said, "I would like to see the spring box, if you would permit it." She took him to the cut bank. She showed him the plank crib with its clay lining and stone bed. She showed him the intake where the spring water entered the pipe, still running, still clear, still carrying the ground's steady temperature. She showed him the fall line from the box to the cabin, the grade stakes still standing, the trench packed and covered. Ezra crouched at the spring box and put his hand in the water. He held it there for a long time. When he pulled it out, he looked at his wet fingers the way a man looks at something he cannot reconcile with what he has believed for 58 years. "How warm?" he asked. "Not warm, warmer than the air. warmer than frozen ground. That is all it needs to be. Ezra stood up slowly. He put his hat back on. He said, I have rebuilt cabins for 12 years. I have never seen anyone build one from underneath. He did not apologize. Ezra was not a man who apologized, but he did something more useful. He went back to the Crossroads store and told 4 men what he had seen. He described the spring box, the pipe, the fall, the outlet, the floor temperature during the storm. He described it accurately, without embellishment, in the flat factual language of a man who had spent his life measuring things that could kill you. Within a week, 3 families had walked to Clara's cabin to look at the system. They came with questions she had not anticipated. Where did the pipe come from? How deep must the outlet run? How much fall is enough over 30 feet? Over 50? Can a spring box be built in frozen ground if the spring is active? Will open runnels work if iron pipe cannot be found? What if the spring is seasonal? What if the water carries grit that will clog the joints? Clara answered what she could. She showed them the trench route. She lifted boards so they could see the pipe beneath. She walked them to the outlet and the spring box. She gave them Niels's formula for joint sealing, oakum, pine tar, clay, and showed them the bottle and cord method for checking grade. Martha Keene came last. She came alone, without her husband, on a morning when the sky was the color of iron and the temperature was steady at 12 degrees. She washed through the yard and into the cabin without knocking, the way neighbors do when they have moved past formality into something more honest. She stood on the floor. She looked down. "Show me," she said. Clara lifted the board. Martha crouched and looked at the pipe in the crawl space. She put her hand on the iron. She held it there for 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then she replaced the board and stood up. "It is warmer than my floor," Martha said, "and my husband cut 7 cords. It does not replace a stove. It changes the floor. My youngest sleeps on the floor." Martha paused. "He sleeps on the coldest surface in the house. Every winter, every night." Clara said nothing. She did not need to. Martha was not asking for persuasion. She was arriving at a conclusion her own body had already reached. "My husband will say no," Martha said. "He will say it is strange and unnecessary, and that cordwood is what he knows. Your husband is welcome to come and put his hand on the pipe." Martha smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, tight and tired. The smile of a woman who has learned that surviving is not the same as solving. "He will come," she said, "after I tell him about the floor. He will come because I will stop talking about it only when he does." She left with the egg basket and the beginning of a change that would take 3 winters to complete. The first wave of curiosity was genuine and practical. People wanted to know if the method worked. The storm had provided proof so extreme that even the most skeptical could not dismiss it. Clara's cabin had sheltered 8 people through the worst night of the winter, while houses with full wood piles and sound stoves had cracked, smoked, and failed. But curiosity brought Silas Rook's attention with it. Silas did not come to Clara's cabin. He did not ask to see the pipe. He went instead to the Crossroads store and began telling men that the idea was obvious, and that anyone could have done it, and that the credit belonged not to Clara, but to common sense. He said he had been thinking about spring water since before the widow arrived in the valley. He said the pipe was a simple application of what any man who worked a mine already knew about underground heat. He said he planned to install a version on his own property, better designed, with proper materials, not salvaged scrap from a bankrupt rail spur. When Clara heard about this, she was standing in the yard mixing a new batch of pine tar sealer for a joint that had developed a weep under the sustained cold. She listened. She did not answer. She went back to the joint, but Niels heard it, and Niels answered. He found Silas at the store and said, in front of 3 men and the storekeeper. You did not think about spring water. You thought about buying her claim when the water killed her. I was there. I heard you say it. Silas turned red. He said Niels was a drifter and a foreigner and had no standing to speak about the valley's business. Niels said, I have laid 9 miles of pipe. You have laid none. That is my standing. It was the only time Niels fought for Clara in public. He preferred correction to confrontation, but he had spent 6 weeks watching a woman build something the valley mocked, and he would not watch a man who had bet on her failure claim the credit for her survival. The exchange did not silence Silas. It sharpened him. He began telling people that Clara's system was dangerous, that spring water under a floor would bring disease, rot, and foundation failure within 2 years. He told the families who had visited Clara's cabin that they would be fools to copy a method built by a widow and a Norwegian drifter with salvaged pipe. The campaign was not purely malicious. Silas still wanted the claim. Clara's survival had not changed that. Her growing reputation had made it worse. If Clara became the person the valley consulted about winter heat, her claim became more valuable, her position more secure, and Silas's chance of acquiring the route she sat on more remote. Every family that copied her system was a family that owed Clara respect instead of Silas lumber. Clara did not fight Silas directly. She did not have time. She had a system to maintain, a son to nurse back to full health, and a mentor who was teaching her things she could not learn from anyone else. Niels stayed through the post-storm weeks. The arrangement was simple. He occupied the goat shed, insulated now with the skirting material Clara had learned to pack, and took meals at her table. In exchange, he helped her design improvements to the spring system and taught her everything he knew about water management in cold ground. They worked together the way 2 people work who share a language nobody else speaks. When Clara said the outlet pressure felt lower on mornings after hard frost, Niels did not ask how she measured outlet pressure without a gauge. He understood that she meant the water sounded different against the plank chase, that the flow looked thinner where it hit the stock trench, that the steam rose less vigorously. She was reading the system by sound, sight, and touch, the same way he had read pipe runs for 30 years. He taught her to design simpler versions. Not every cabin in the valley sat near a pressured spring. Not every family could find or afford iron pipe. Niels showed Clara how to build a shorter underbench warming run for cabins too small for a full underfloor loop, a single pipe section running beneath a sleeping platform, fed by a closer spring source and returning through a shorter outlet. He showed her how to build a spring box with a removable silt trap so the intake would not clog during the spring thaw when runoff carried gravel and debris. He showed her insulated outlet chases using plank and manure pack instead of deep burial for cabins on flat ground where digging below frost line was impractical. Each design was a conversation. Clara would propose an approach. Niels would find the flaw. Clara would revise. Niels would test the revision against the worst conditions he had seen in 40 years of pipe work. They argued. They disagreed. Once, over the proper slope for a shortened outlet run, Clara insisted that a steeper grade would clear debris faster. Niels said a steeper grade would drain the pipe empty during slow flow periods and create an air gap that would freeze from the inside. You're thinking about speed, he told her. Think about consistency. A pipe half full of air is a pipe half dead. She was wrong. He was right. She changed the grade, but the argument mattered because it was the kind of argument that only happens between people who take each other's work seriously. One evening in late January, after a day of redesigning the silt trap, Niels told Clara about the waterworks in Stillwater, Minnesota. He had been 29, part of a crew laying wooden stave pipe from a spring-fed reservoir to a distribution point 6 blocks away. The pipe ran under a road that was used by heavy freight. One night in March, a loaded wagon cracked a stave joint. Water flooded under the road surface and froze. By morning, the road was a sheet of ice under a shell of packed earth, and a milk cart horse broke its leg on it. The crew was blamed. The contractor fired 3 men, including Niels. "I learned something that day," Niels said. "The water does not care about your plan. The water does what the ground and the cold tell it to do. Your plan only works if you have listened to the ground first." Clara asked if that was why he had noticed her checking the grade with twine and a water bead, the first thing he saw when he arrived at her claim. "Yes," Niels said. "You were listening. You were listening wrong, with the wind pushing your bead. But you were listening. That is rarer than you think." He paused. He looked at the lamp on the table. The flame was steady, the room warm, the water moving beneath them in the dark. "The trick was never pipe," Niels said. "The trick was seeing the place as a machine." It was the last clear thing he taught her. In the second week of February, Niels crossed the creek at a ford that should have been frozen solid, but had opened during a midday thaw. He went through to his waist. The mule pulled him out. He walked back to Clara's claim in wet clothes in 18-degree air, and by the time he reached the goat shed, he was shaking in the deep, involuntary way that means the body has lost its argument with the cold. Clara dried him. She wrapped him in blankets and put him on the floor above the pipe run, the warmest place in the cabin, the place where Ezra's grandchildren had slept, the place where Silas's man had recovered. She boiled water and made him drink. She kept the stove burning through the night. The cough started at dawn, wet, deep, rattling. The same sound Jonah had made, but Niels was 64, and 64-year-old lungs that had breathed sawdust and pipe grease and winter air for 4 decades did not fight the same way a 6-year-old's did. He weakened over 2 weeks. The cough settled into his chest like a tenant with no intention of leaving. Clara brought him broth and tea and sat with him and listened to him breathe and watched the man who had taught her to see a cabin as a machine slowly lose the machine of his own body. Martha came to help. She did not explain why. She simply arrived with a jar of mustard plaster and a bundle of clean linen and the particular competence of a mother who had nursed 5 children through winter sickness. She applied the plaster to Niels's chest. She changed his wrappings. She told Clara to sleep. Clara did not sleep. On the 27th of March, a morning when the light was long enough to feel like spring was remembering its name, Niels asked Clara to bring him the cord line from his coat pocket. She brought it. He held it in his fist, the same cord he had used to check the grade of 9 miles of pipe across 30 years and 3 territories. He closed his hand around it and looked at Clara. "You will need to check the spring box after thaw," he said. "The runoff carries silt. Use the screen I showed you. Clean it twice in April." "I will." "The outlet chase needs fresh packing before next winter. Manure and plank, not just plank." "I know." He looked at the cord line. He looked at her. He said nothing else for a while. Then he said, "I came here for goat milk and a sharpened adze." Clara put her hand over his. The cord line was between their palms. She could feel the twist of the fibers, worn smooth by years of handling, marked with the stains of every soil it had been pressed against. Niels died that afternoon. The cough had taken the fight out of him gradually, and the stopping was quiet, almost polite, as if his body had decided to leave the way he had entered Clara's claim, without announcement, without spectacle, with a practical steadiness that respected the work still to be done by those who remained. Clara buried him on the slope beside Levi, within sight of the spring box. She kept the cord line. She put it in the drawer by the lamp where she could reach it at night when the cabin was dark and the water was the only sound, and the man who had taught her to listen was no longer there to tell her what she heard. The valley did not stop for Niels Tollefsson's death, and neither did the water. Spring came with the particular violence of a Montana thaw, sudden, excessive, and indifferent to what lay in its path. Snowmelt swelled every drainage, the creek overran its banks. Seep springs that had been steady flows became surging pulses of silted water. Clara's spring box handled the change. She cleaned the silt screen Niels had designed twice in the first week of April, just as he had told her. She monitored the outlet for debris blockage. She checked the grade stakes for erosion damage. The system held because she had built it with a man who understood that spring was as dangerous to pipe as winter. But a family named Hargrove, who lived a mile and a half up the valley, had copied Clara's method during a warm spell in February. They had done it without consulting her, working from a second-hand description passed along at the store. They had the broad idea, spring water under a floor through pipe, but not the specific knowledge. Their spring box was a shallow pit lined with loose stone. Their pipe was lighter gauge, not sealed with pine tar, packed only with clay. Their outlet was 10 inches below grade with no plank chase and no windshield. On the 9th of April, spring runoff overwhelmed the Hargrove spring box. Silt flooded the intake. The lighter pipe joints, already loosened by frost cycling, gave way at 2 points under the increased flow pressure. Muddy water pooled under their cabin floor and turned the crawl space to a slick bog that stank of mineral sediment. The Hargroves abandoned the system. They pulled the pipe and sealed the entry. And they told everyone at the store that Clara's method was a fraud, that it worked for one winter and destroyed your foundation in the spring. Clara heard the accusation from Martha, who delivered it with the flat tone of a woman relaying bad news she had not caused but could not prevent. "They are saying the spring water rotted the floor," Martha said. "They are saying your method is winter comfort and spring ruin. Silas is using it. He's telling men that the Hargrove house proves what he said all along." Clara went to the Hargrove cabin. She walked a mile and a half on a muddy road with the cord line in her pocket and Niels's voice in her head saying, "The water does not care about your plan." She looked at the failed spring box. She saw loose stone where there should have been clay-lined crib. She saw the pipe joints, light gauge, clay-packed, no pine tar, no oakum fiber. She saw the outlet trench at 10 inches where it should have been 26. She saw every error that Niels had corrected in her own system, repeated by people who had copied the visible shape of the method without understanding the invisible discipline that held it together. She told the Hargroves what had failed and why. She was not gentle about it. She could not afford to be. If the valley decided that spring-fed floor warming was a fraud based on one bad copy, then everything she had survived, the storm, the skeptics, the midnight digging, the blood in Jonah's cough, would be reduced to a story about a widow who got lucky once. She redesigned the Hargrove intake. She showed them how to build a proper crib with clay lining, overflow relief, and the debris screen Nils had taught her. She showed them how to reseal the joints with oakum and pine tar. She dug the outlet deeper herself, cutting through wet spring earth to 24 inches, and built plank chase over the exit point. She did all of this without Niels. She applied his lessons. She used his cord line. She heard his corrections in her memory. Your fall is short. Bury the weak point. Think about consistency. She fixed what strangers had broken using knowledge a dead man had given her, and when she finished, the Hargrove system was sound. The repair changed the conversation. Silas had used the Hargrove failure to discredit the method. Clara's public fix of the failure discredited the discrediting. She had walked to the problem, diagnosed it in front of witnesses, and solved it with materials and knowledge that were available to anyone willing to learn. Three neighboring households began their own modified spring systems in the weeks that followed, this time under Clara's direct instruction. She taught them in groups of 2 and 3, walking the ground with them, checking the grade with Niels's cord line, insisting on pine tar sealing and deep outlet burial and proper spring box construction. She taught Martha first, not because Martha's house needed it most, but because Martha had asked honest questions before she asked easy favors, and because Martha would teach her own husband, who would teach the men he worked with, who would carry the knowledge further than Clara's voice alone could reach. She taught widows and older couples who lacked cutting power for large wood piles. She taught a family whose spring was too far from their cabin for a full underfloor run, designing for them the shortened bench warming system Niels had proposed. She taught the operator of a boarding shack where drift repeatedly killed the kitchen fire, rooting a spring feed beneath the cooking platform so the work surface stayed above freezing even when the stove was out. Each teaching was a conversation. Each conversation was a version of the argument Clara had first had with Martha in her own yard. Is this possible? Is this sane? Why would you drag iron when you should drag wood? And each time, Clara answered the way she had answered Martha, because I cannot drag enough wood, and the water is there. Silas watched the spread with the particular fury of a man who had bet on the wrong outcome and could not stop the right one from multiplying. He installed a crude version of the system on his own property, fast, cheap, without enough fall in the pipe run, without proper joint sealing, without the outlet depth that Niels had insisted on. He installed it not because he believed in it, but because he could not tolerate Clara being the only source of knowledge the valley needed. The system sludged up within a month. Insufficient grade let silt settle in the pipe belly. The joints leaked because clay alone does not hold against frost cycling. The outlet froze twice because it was too shallow. Clara diagnosed the failure when Silas's foreman came to her cabin and asked, in the embarrassed mumble of a man following orders he does not agree with, whether Clara could take a look at the boss's pipe run. She went. She walked Silas's property with the cord line and the glass bottle. She found the grade belly in the same place her own system had originally bellied, at the midpoint, where the eye misjudges fall because the terrain flattens and the instinct is to trust the slope. She found the joints weeping silt-brown water. She found the outlet frozen shut. She diagnosed every failure in front of the same men who had once laughed at her pipe at the freight siding. She did not raise her voice. She did not remind anyone of what they had said. She simply pointed at each fault and named it the way Niels would have named it, plainly, specifically, without satisfaction. Your fall is short by 2 inches at the belly. Your joints have no fiber under the clay. Your outlet is 11 inches below grade. It needs 24 at minimum. Silas stood at the edge of his yard and watched her correct his work. His face was the color of old brick. His foreman took notes on a piece of board with charcoal. Clara finished her inspection and walked home. She did not offer to fix Silas's system. She did not offer to teach him. She had given him the diagnosis. What he did with it was his own business. What she had done, without intending it, was dismantle his authority in front of his own men. Silas had built his position on controlling what the valley needed: cut timber, hauling capacity, freight access. Clara had demonstrated that the valley also needed knowledge he did not have, and knowledge, unlike timber, could not be bought at a yard. By the end of April, Clara's place had become something the valley had not imagined it would need. Not a store, not a freight office, not a church or a school, a source. People came to her not for charity or trade, but for understanding: how to read a spring, how to check a grade, how to seal a joint, how to make a cabin work as a machine instead of a box. She was 32 years old. She had been widowed for 8 months. She had buried her husband and her mentor on the same slope. She had survived a winter that broke stoves and cracked chimneys and froze men in their bunks. And she had done it with $31, one axe, 6 lengths of salvaged pipe, and a memory of her father's hand on a warm board in Ohio. The cord line was still in the drawer by the lamp, the water was still in the pipe, and the valley, for the first time, was listening to the ground. The second winter was not as brutal as the first. No single storm matched the January 9th collapse. But the cold was steady and long, and it tested every system in the valley the way a slow weight tests a beam, not with the drama of a single blow, but with the grinding certainty of pressure that does not relent. Clara's system held. She had repacked the outlet chase with fresh manure and plank in October, the way Niels had instructed. She had cleaned the silt screen 3 times during the autumn rains. She had checked every joint with the glass bottle and cord line, tightening the clay shell where frost cycling had cracked it, and retarring the oakum where seepage showed as a faint dark stain on the crawlspace earth. The pipe ran steady through November, December, January, February. The floor stayed warm. Jonah slept through the nights. The stove burned at half load, and the cabin held. The families she had taught fared differently, depending on how closely they had listened. Martha Keene's system ran clean all winter. Martha's husband had dug the trench himself, grumbling the entire time about dragging iron when he should be dragging wood. But he had dug it to Clara's grade specifications and sealed the joints with the oakum tar clay method and buried the outlet to 24 inches. When Martha told Clara in February that her youngest had not woken once from cold since November, Clara understood that the knowledge had traveled exactly the way she had intended, through a woman who asked honest questions to a man who trusted the woman who asked them. The boarding shack operator lost his outlet to ice twice, both times because he had skimped on the plank chase depth. Clara showed him the fix. He dug deeper. The third time held. The family with the distant spring, the one Clara had designed the shortened bench warming system for, found that the single pipe section beneath the sleecing platform kept the platform surface above freezing, but did not warm the rest of the room. They asked Clara for more pipe. She told them the truth. One section was what the spring could support at that distance. If they wanted more coverage, they needed to bring the spring closer or move the cabin. They did neither. They learned to sleep on the platform and live with cold floors elsewhere. It was not perfect. It was better than what they had before. By the end of the second winter, Clara had helped install or advise on 7 systems in the valley. 7 households with some version of spring-fed warming, full underfloor runs, bench systems, protected spring boxes, sealed pipe joints. 7 families that burned less wood, lost less sleep, and feared the floor less. Silas Rook was not among them. His sludged system had been torn out in the fall. He had replaced it with nothing. He heated his bunkhouse and his storehouse the conventional way, iron stoves, cut timber, brute labor, and he said nothing about spring water in public. But he said things in private. His foreman reported to Clara through Martha's husband that Silas had been asking questions about grade and fall and outlet depth. He was asking them of his own men, not of Clara, and his men were repeating Clara's answers because they had been present when she diagnosed Silas's failures, and they had taken notes on a piece of board with charcoal. Silas was learning from Clara at a distance of one intermediary, and the intermediary did not know he was serving that function. It would have been funny if Silas were not also the man holding the debt note tied to Levi's freight, the remaining obligation from the wagon accident that had killed Clara's husband. The note was small, $14, but Silas held it, and holding it gave him a lever he had not yet used. The third winter used it. In December of 1889, Silas's storehouse pipe, a new installation, built by his men using the notes from Clara's diagnosis, failed at the outlet. Not a freeze this time. A great error compounded by a pipe section that had a casting flaw invisible from the outside. The water backed up overnight, pooled under the storehouse floor, and by morning the stored grain sacks along the south wall were sitting in 2 inches of standing water. Wet grain in December is not a nuisance. It is a loss that multiplies. Mold starts in hours. Rot follows. The grain becomes feed for nothing except the mud it sits in. Silas lost 8 sacks of winter grain. At valley prices, that was $26 of feed and seed he could not replace until the spring freight arrived. He came to Clara's cabin at night. He came alone. He did not bring his foreman or his men or his authority. He came the way Ezra Bell had come after the January storm, on foot, in the dark, carrying the weight of a man who needs something from the person he tried to destroy. Clara opened the door. Silas stood in the frame. He was not wearing the expression she expected. She expected anger, or the hard mask men wear when they are about to negotiate from weakness. What she saw was tiredness. Plain, simple, mortal tiredness. The tiredness of a man who had spent 3 years fighting a woman's idea and had run out of reasons and grain simultaneously. "I need you to look at my storehouse line," he said. Clara looked at him. She thought about the pipe he had stepped on at the freight siding. She thought about the men he had told not to lend her tools. She thought about the gossip he had amplified, the Hargrove failure he had weaponized, the credit he had tried to steal, the claim he had tried to buy for $60 when her husband's body was still warm in the ground. She thought about $14 of debt on a note he could call at any time. "I will look at your storehouse line," Clara said, "and you will bring me 3 things. Silas waited. The debt note, signed over, canceled. His jaw tightened, but he did not leave. "Your word, given in front of Ezra Bell and Martha Keene, that you will stop claiming the method as your own invention." His face darkened, but he did not leave. "And labor, 2 days of your men's time, not for me, for the widow Pratt on the North Fork, who has no pipe and no help and whose stove cracked last week." Silas stood in the doorway and looked at a woman who had $31 and a dead husband 9 months ago and now held more authority in the valley than his timber yard gave him. He looked at her and understood that the terms were not negotiable because the knowledge was not for sale. Clara would help him because she helped everyone who asked honestly. But Silas had not asked honestly for 3 years, and the cost of that dishonesty was a debt note, a public admission, and labor for a widow he would never have noticed. "The note," he said, "the word, the labor." Yes. He left. He came back the next morning with the debt note, unsigned but present. Clara told him the signature happened first. He signed it at her table, with Jonah watching from the corner, chewing a piece of dried apple. Clara put the note in the drawer beside Niels's cord line. 2 debts settled in the same place, one in money, one in memory. She fixed his storehouse line in an afternoon. The casting flaw was in the 3rd section from the intake, a thin spot in the pipe wall that had sweated under pressure until the iron wept. She cut the section out, spliced in a replacement from her own salvage stock, and resealed the joints. She checked the grade with the cord line and found it true. The failure had been material, not design. His men had learned the lesson from her diagnosis well enough to get the fall right. They had simply been unlucky with a bad pipe. She told Silas this. She told him his men had done good work on the grade. She did not tell him more than that. But Silas heard what she did not say, that his men had learned from her, that the knowledge had passed through his own operation without his permission, and that the system worked when built correctly, regardless of who built it. Silas gave the word publicly at the store, with Ezra and Martha present, that the spring method was Clara's work and not his. He said it the way a man pays a fine, quickly, without elaboration, wanting it finished. Ezra nodded. Martha said nothing. The storekeeper wrote it in the margins of the ledger, which was the closest thing the valley had to a public record. Silas sent 2 men to the widow Pratt's cabin the following week. They dug a trench, laid pipe Clara provided from her remaining salvage, and built a spring box under Clara's direction. The widow Pratt was 61 years old and had been heating her cabin with a stove she could barely feed. The pipe run changed her winter from a siege into a season. Silas never thanked Clara. He never apologized. He never acknowledged that he had been wrong, but he stopped fighting her, and in a valley where opposition had material consequences, the absence of opposition was as good as alliance. Elias Morrow arrived in the valley in the spring of 1890, leading a wagon loaded with forge tools and a look on his face that said he had left somewhere he did not intend to discuss. He was 38, widowed 2 years prior, a blacksmith by trade who had worked foundry and fabrication in Butte before the work dried up or his grief drove him out. Clara never learned which, and she did not ask. He had hands that were burned smooth across the palms from forge work, and a habit of examining every piece of iron he encountered the way a horseman examines a horse, structurally, appreciatively, noting the quality of the metal before considering what it could become. He came to Clara's cabin because the crossroads storekeeper told him that a woman up the feeder road needed pipe collars fabricated for a spring water system, and that she paid in goat cheese, sharpened tools, and technical conversation. Elias looked at the pipe run. He looked at the joints. He looked at the spring box and the outlet chase and the grade stakes. He crouched at the entry point where the pipe passed through the cabin foundation and ran his finger along the seal. "Who taught you to pack oakum like this?" he asked. "A man named Nils Tollefson. He was a pipe man. He was a ditcher and a sawyer, and the best teacher I have met." Elias stood up. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has found the one thing in the valley he did not expect to find: competence applied to a problem he understood. "Your collars are sound," he said, "but they are field sealed. If you let me forge proper flanged collars with bolt seats, your joints will outlast the pipe." Clara told him what she could pay. It was not much. Elias said he did not need much. He needed a place to set up a forge and work that interested him. The pipe collars interested him. The spring system interested him. The woman who had built it with salvage iron and a ditcher's cord line interested him, though he did not say that part aloud. He set up the forge in a lean-to behind the goat shed. He fabricated collars for Clara's system first, flanged iron rings that bolted around the pipe joints, and compressed the oakum tar clay seal into a permanent, pressure-resistant gasket. The improvement was significant. Where Clara's field seals required annual inspection and occasional repacking, Elias's forged collars held without maintenance through an entire winter. He fabricated collars for Martha's system next, then for the boarding shack, then for the Hargroves. Each set was slightly different, fitted to the pipe gauge and joint spacing of the individual installation. Elias worked the way Clara built, specifically, precisely, with attention to the particular conditions of each site rather than a single solution applied everywhere. They talked over the forge. They talked over the spring box. They talked over the outlet chase in the October rain while checking the grade before the third winter. Their conversations were not romantic in any way a person watching would have recognized. They were the conversations of 2 people who understood the same materials and respected the same tolerances, and found, in the overlap of their knowledge, a form of intimacy that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with shared seriousness. Elias proposed in March of 1891. He did it by building a new hatch frame for the main pipe run, a hinged access panel that replaced the loose board Clara had been lifting every time she checked the system. The frame was forged iron, fitted to the floor joists, with a latch that held against drafts and a lip that seated flush with the surrounding boards. He installed it on a Sunday. Clara watched him work. When he finished, he opened the hatch, and they both looked down at the pipe running steady in the crawl space, dark iron against dark earth, water moving in the silence. "I have repaired everything in this valley," Elias said, "except the part of mine that goes home alone." Clara looked at the hatch. She looked at the man who had built it. She said, "Close the hatch. Stay for supper. We will discuss terms." They married in April. The storekeeper performed the ceremony because the nearest minister still charged $4 for the ride, and Clara had never seen the value in paying for words she could say herself. The years after the marriage compressed the way years do when the work is steady and the emergencies are smaller. Clara and Elias added one room to the cabin, a workshop where Elias forged pipe fittings and Clara stored the supplies she used for teaching: oakum, pine tar, lengths of salvage pipe, the glass bottle, the cord line. The original cabin stayed the same size. The original pipe run stayed beneath the original floor. Clara would not enlarge it. The 12 by 16 room with its 18-foot underfloor loop was the proof of concept that had saved her son and sheltered her enemies, and taught a valley that heat could come from patience and grade and moving water. She would not change it any more than she would rewrite the story of her own survival. Jonah grew up knowing the system the way farm children know their land, through the body, through the seasons, through the annual rhythms of maintenance and repair. He could check a grade by the time he was 9. He could pack a joint by the time he was 12. By 15, he was helping Clara teach, walking new families through the spring box and outlet construction with the careful thoroughness of a boy who had slept on warm boards, while other children woke shivering, and who understood, without needing to be told, that the warmth beneath him was not magic, but method. Clara held teaching days before the first freeze each autumn. Families came from across the valley and eventually from neighboring drainages. She taught them in the yard, at the spring box, in the crawl space. She taught them the same things Niels had taught her, in the same order: grade first, joint second, outlet third, skirting last. She taught them to check fall with a bottle and cord. She taught them that the water does not care about your plan. By the mid-1890s, half a dozen households in the valley used some version of Clara's spring logic: full underfloor runs for cabins near pressured springs, bench warming systems for smaller dwellings, protected spring boxes with silt screens, insulated outlet chases, banked crawl space warming for houses that could not find pipe but could channel a shallow spring run through a clay-lined trench beneath the floor. The valley changed in details, not declarations. Fewer frantic late autumn wood buys at the store. Cabins banked better, skirted fully, sealed with the attention that comes from understanding heat as something managed rather than something burned. Spring sites assessed as assets when claims were evaluated. A pressured spring within 40 feet of a cabin foundation added value that a cord of wood could not match. Widows and elderly settlers no longer dismissed as winter certainties. People who could not swing an axe could still operate a spring system, and the knowledge Clara taught did not require the strength that the old method demanded. Martha Keene's husband eventually admitted that the system worked. He admitted it the way men of that era admitted that their wives had been right, indirectly, through action, by helping his neighbor dig a trench without being asked, and by telling his sons to learn the method before they learned to fell timber. Martha told Clara about this. Clara said, "He dug the trench to your grade. That was always the point." Martha laughed. It was the first time Clara had heard her laugh without reservation. Ezra Bell lived another 6 years. He never installed a spring system himself. His cabin sat on clay ground with no nearby spring, and the method was not universal. a fact Clara always stated clearly. But he became the system's most credible advocate precisely because he had been its most credible skeptic. When new settlers asked whether the widow's pipe trick was real or frontier legend, Ezra told them what he had felt under his hands on the floor of Clara's cabin during the worst night of the winter of 1888. He told them in the same flat, factual language he used for everything, and they believed him because Ezra Bell did not deal in stories. He dealt in math. Clara never claimed the method would work everywhere. She never claimed it replaced the stove or eliminated the need for cut wood. She claimed what she had proven, that a pressured spring, captured in sealed pipe, run beneath a cabin floor at proper grade, with a protected outlet and a banked crawl space, could change the survival math for a specific class of households in a specific kind of terrain. That was enough. It had been enough to save her son, earn the respect of a man who predicted her death, convert a woman who believed only in cord counts, and break the authority of a man who thought he controlled everything the valley needed. She lived out her later years in the same valley, in the same small cabin enlarged by one room, but never stripped of the original run beneath the boards. She kept Niels's cord line in the drawer by the lamp. When Elias asked once why she did not hang it on the wall where visitors could see it, she said, "Tools belong in drawers, trophies go on walls." She did not consider the cord line a trophy. She considered it unfinished work, the continuation of a measurement that Niels had started and she had carried forward, and that someone after her would carry further because the ground did not stop needing to be read just because the reader changed. Clara Wren Hale died in the spring of 1912, in the room where she had laid the first pipe, on a morning when the light was long enough that she could see the slope where Levi and Niels were buried without lifting her head from the pillow. Jonah was beside her. Elias was at the forge, shaping a collar for a system 3 valleys away, and he came in when Jonah called and held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the pipe beneath them was not already saying. After the funeral, neighbors lifted a board in the old cabin just to hear the water still moving. Within 10 years of that first January storm, at least half a dozen households in the valley ran some version of the system Clara built with salvage iron and a ditcher's knowledge. The spread was visible not in speeches or in records, but in winter details. Children sleeping on floor pallets without frost on blanket edges. Women drawing morning water from buckets that had not frozen overnight. And fewer men riding in the dark to beg for split wood from neighbors who could not spare it. Clara Wren Hale lived and died in the same valley, in a cabin she never left and never wanted to. She enlarged it by one room. She never stripped the original pipe run. The cord line stayed in the drawer by the lamp until Jonah moved it to his own house, where it sat in a drawer by his own lamp, where his children knew not to touch it and his wife knew not to ask why. On a January morning, decades after the storm, the kind of morning when the air is still and the cold is deep and the iron stoves tick across the valley as the metal contracts against the temperature, the water beneath Clara's old floor kept its quiet sound. It moved through dark pipe under worn boards, carrying the earth's steadier season the way it had carried it since the autumn she laid the line. Ezra Bell had stood in her yard and told her the math. When the stove iron splits and that water turns the floor to ice, he had said, you and that boy will die inside the week. The stove iron did split. The water did not turn the floor to ice. Clara Wren Hale and that boy did not die inside the week, or inside the winter, or inside the years that followed. Not because winter was beaten forever, not because one woman solved the frontier, because a widow with $31 understood that the safest heat in that valley was the heat that did not panic, the heat that moved beneath the floor in its own season, steady and dark and quiet, long after the stoves went cold.